Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Today I have with me Professor Amie Thomasson from Dartmouth College. So Amie is a professor of philosophy who specializes in ontology. She's written a number of books on ontology, one called Ordinary Objects, another called Fiction and Metaphysics, and then one called Ontology Made Easy, which is the one that we're going to be focusing on during this discussion. So welcome, Amie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So
I first ran into your work, I think, just by going through some material on YouTube. You had this really great talk there called "Do Tables and Chairs Exist?"
Oh yeah.
Which I think for a lot of people, they see a title like that and it's like, what are philosophers doing? You know. But I listened to it and it got into some interesting questions that I had been thinking about recently, because my disposition has always been fairly, say deflationary and kind of nominalist. And we're going to go into some of these terms when we discuss. But because I had always had this kind of deflationary attitude, I think just almost by default tended to be fairly nominalistic and tended to have this very sparse idea about how ontology should be. And I had actually in recent months been sort of thinking that, you know, if you're really going to be kind of deflationary about existence, then you have to really look at what the word existence means. Mm-hmm. And starting to think about that started to make me think that maybe really being deflationary might actually lead to an ontology in which that's actually a lot more like bloated. Mm-hmm. And I had just sort of started to think along those terms when I discovered your work, and then I started reading your book, and that really kind of reinvigorated these ideas for me, and I'm very interested to discuss them with you.
Great.
So that's just kind of like the background of how I got into your work. But let's kind of start from the beginning. So let's make clear just what we're actually talking about. What exactly is ontology?
Ontology is usually thought of as the study of what exists. So it's usually thought of, these days at least, as a sort of sub-branch of metaphysics. That is that part of metaphysics that deals with existence questions. So traditionally, I mean, if you even go back to Plato and Aristotle, they're concerned with questions, for example, about whether the forms exist, right? And if not, do some kind of universals that are embodied in the world as Aristotle would have had it exist, and so on. You go through to the medievals and the moderns, and you also get questions about, for example, the existence of God. Does God exist? Does free will exist, for example? Do numbers exist? Do universals exist? Those are questions that persist. What's kind of happened in the last half a century or so is that these existence questions have proliferated, as well as the sort of what are regarded as plausible answers to them, so that now not just questions like that arise in ontology, but also questions like, do tables and chairs exist? Do people exist? Where you might have thought the answer was quite obvious. Or there's another range of questions involving sort of distinctive philosophical concepts. Do things like mereological sums and temporal parts and things like that exist? And again, we can get into what those mean later, but this is part of the way in which these kinds of ontological questions have really mushroomed in the last few decades, as well as those positions, all of them that are thought to be plausible, well beyond what was in traditional ontology.
Yeah, so I think the first question, I think, for anybody who hasn't already been diving into this is why would you question it in the first place? Or even if you did question it, you know, why wouldn't the answer just be an immediate yes? So even though I know your view is that tables and chairs and such do exist, can you give a kind of quick summary of what are some of the arguments that have actually brought this into serious question? What are some of the arguments that have convinced some really smart philosophers that tables and chairs don't exist?
Sure, yeah. So there've been quite a variety. It was in Ordinary Objects, in the sort of prior book of mine, that I try to confront a lot of these specific arguments. Here's one, right? So Trenton Merrickx says roughly this. Look, if baseballs exist, then they'd have to be the sort of thing that has causal powers. It has the power to break windows if it hits it hard enough and so on, right? But we know from contemporary science that whatever causal powers we would normally say the baseball has are actually better accounted for by the powers of the subatomic particles that we normally say make up the baseball. But if that's got all the causal powers, then we'd have to say, if the baseball existed, that it didn't have any causal powers. But it doesn't make any sense to say that a baseball exists but lacks causal powers, so the baseball is the sort of thing that can be hit, that can break windows, and so on. So we better deny that baseballs exist. That's a kind of causal redundancy argument. That is not, and it's not just in his work, but you'll see elsewhere arguments along the lines of such and such doesn't have causal powers, therefore it doesn't exist. And Merrickx takes it further to say this leads us to a kind of contradiction in the idea of baseballs, because they'd have to be something that both exists and doesn't exist. Other kinds of arguments, a sort of older form of argument against things of various kinds, are the so-called Sorites arguments. So it's arguments that are based on the ancient paradox of the heap. They go something like this. Look, if there's such a thing as a table, let's say we'll do tables rather than heaps, then removing one tiny particle from it can't make a difference to whether there's a table or not. So then, suppose you do that, then you've still got a table. So removing one particle from a table leaves you with a table. But of course, if you do that same procedure over and over again, if you accept the general principle that removing one particle can't turn a table into a non-table, then you've got to accept that a single particle at some stage is a table. Oh, but that can't be, right? And so some people, again, conclude that there's a contradiction in the concept, and so there can't be anything answering to it. Others think that, say, ordinary objects violate some general metaphysical principles, like that there can't be two things in the same place at the same time. So if you think that there are ordinary objects, you think that there's, say, a statue in the National Museum of Art or whatever, but you also think there's a lump of clay on the pedestal. But then, there have to be two objects in the same place at the same time, the statue and the lump of clay, but that can't be, right? Or there's another sort of facet of this that's brought up as the grounding problem that says, but the statue and the lump of clay would have to have different modal properties. The statue couldn't survive a change of shape, but you could have the same lump of clay if it's, say, soft, that's reshaped. Mm-hmm. Right? But what could possibly ground the difference between these modal properties in the statue versus the lump of clay? Doesn't seem to be any possible grounding, so we better deny that one of them exists and just accept the other. But maybe some people say it would be just arbitrary to accept one but not the other, so we better deny them both and just accept the particles that make them up. There's a range of others. I don't know how long you want to talk about this part, but there's worries about rivalry with a scientific worldview, for example, and the general motivation really only comes about from taking a kind of neo-Quinean approach to questions about what exists, which I think we'll probably talk about shortly, that thinks of the job of ontology as a matter of working out the best total theory and figuring out what exists according to that. And then if you can argue that your theory that doesn't posit tables encounters fewer problems by not encountering problems of vagueness, for example, or violating metaphysical principles, is better than a rival that does accept them, then you're thought to be better off with a theory that doesn't accept ordinary objects. So in my work on this, I really started off by wanting to offer a view about what ordinary cultural and social objects are. But I found to do that, you have to confront these arguments against them. And then in confronting the arguments against them, which was something that I undertook to do in ordinary objects, I found that they all lead back to this kind of neo-Quinean approach to ontology. So to figure out, if you have the intuition that something's gone wrong somewhere, that has gotten us to the point where these kinds of arguments are taken seriously, then you really have to go back and re-examine the methodology that says to answer these existence questions, get the best total theory, roughly. And that's then what I really step back to try to examine and critique more thoroughly in the next book, Ontology Made Easy.
So can you kind of go over, so you mentioned this neo-Quinean approach. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about what that is? What is that like? What is that neo-Quinean approach that you're referring to?
Yeah. So it's neo-Quinean because those people who like it usually trace it back to Quine. That, I think, is historically problematic in various ways. But roughly, as we see it now, it's the dominant approach to addressing these metaphysical questions. And it's one that is based on Quine's view that we're ontologically committed to and only to those things, as he puts it, that we have to quantify over in our best, he says, scientific theories.
And what does that mean, that we have to quantify over in our scientific theories?
So let me take it back and do a little bit of Quine history and then come back to the contemporary scene. Is that?
Please, yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay. So I think this, when Quine was writing, he was really concerned with avoiding what he saw as some silly questions, really in metaphysics. Quine himself says he was no champion of traditional metaphysics. So he was motivated by looking at arguments like those of Meinong, this Austrian philosopher from the beginning of the 20th century, who said things like this: hey, we can say true things about unicorns, like they have one horn, and they don't exist. So there must, in some sense, be unicorns, because we can say true things about them. Or similarly for even the round square. We could say of it that it's contradictory and that it doesn't exist. So there must be such a thing. Now, Quine thought that was silly. So his criterion was originally designed to say, look, let's not be led astray by language. Just because you use a name doesn't mean, and you want to say true things involving that name, doesn't mean that you're committed to that thing's existing or to there being such a thing. Quine thought we should just use these words, that exists and there is, in the same way. So instead, what he said is, look, we can put the statements that you want to make into sort of standard first order logic. And the quantifier is really just shorthand. It's usually written as the backwards E, just shorthand for there is, or some people read it there exists. And Quine doesn't want to make any difference between those, and neither do I. Okay, some people do. So you don't have to understand unicorns don't exist as referring to unicorns, one-horned creatures, and saying of them they don't exist. You can understand it instead as saying it's not the case that there is something that's a unicorn. Or for everything there is in the world, none of them's a unicorn. Right? You can read them that way. And in that way, you can understand these kinds of truths without having to claim silly things like that unicorns or round squares exist. Okay, so that's all fair enough. Now, Quine was also, of course, very much very scientistic in his outlook. That is, he really thought of science as the source of knowledge, and scientific knowledge as the paradigm of knowledge. So he went on from that basic insight to say, so what should we say? Anyone's committed to? Only whatever they have to say there is to make true those sentences they accept. And what sentences should we accept? Only those that are part of our best scientific theory. So to answer the questions of ontology, Quine said, well, we have to look to our best scientific theory, then put it in standard logical form, and see what we'd have to say exists in order to make it true. So let's bring it back up to the contemporary stage now. So Quine sort of concluded that metaphysics is of a piece with science, because the way to answer these existence questions is via these sort of scientific theories and just figuring out what they have to say there is in order to make them true. Now, a lot of philosophers at this time, this was published by Quine in 1948. And so this was right after the sort of heyday of positivism, which came with the view roughly put that metaphysics is rubbish, right? That most traditional metaphysical questions are just nonsense and should be thrown out, right? Very roughly. A lot of people looked at this piece of Quine's and said, great, metaphysics is just like science. Metaphysics can go again, right? And what we're doing in metaphysics then, and this is sort of what I take to be definitive of the neo-Quinean perspective, is to say that what we're doing in metaphysics is a matter of trying to formulate the best theory and then see what we have to quantify over, what we have to say there is to make it true. So typically today, neo-Quineans think of metaphysics as either sort of a piece with science or analogous to science. Either they say, yeah, we've got to get our best total theory of the world, which is going to be basically a scientific theory, figure out what it commits us to ontologically and go with that. Or there are others who say, look, what we're interested in is a theory of the whole world, and metaphysics is in part doing that, but we're going to weigh up our metaphysical theories like you weigh up scientific theories by their theoretic virtues, by how coherent they are with our common sense views and with each other, by their simplicity, explanatory power, empirical adequacy, although that's not much of an issue for your typical metaphysical debates, and so on. Then we choose our best theory, we figure out what it quantifies over, we've got a view about what exists. So what I take to be sort of characteristic of the neo-Quinean approach is two things. One, the thought that metaphysics, like science, is engaged in discovering or trying to discover deep facts about the world, about what exists and what it's really like. And two, the thought that in doing so, what we need to do is to formulate theories, right? And then evaluate them according to these different theoretical virtues, right? Figure out what the best theory is, and then we'll get our answer, which might turn out to violate common sense in various ways or be surprising or whatever.
I find it interesting that this view says, we should only grant existence to those things that we have to quantify over in order for this theory to hold, because that implies that that you want to keep this as minimal as possible. Right? Like yes. Nothing can be allowed to exist unless it is actually required for it to fit our theory. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about this like the importance of this kind of, I don't know how to put it, maybe minimalism or just that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's an aspect of Quine's view that I haven't talked about yet, and it's important for distinguishing him from me. So here's one thing Quine says in that famous paper on what there is from 1948. Take a sentence like, some dogs are white. Right? In order for that to be true, he says, they've got to be dogs. He says there are some things that are dogs and they're white. But there doesn't have to be a property of whiteness. Mm-hmm. So we don't have to engage in what philosophers call second-order quantification over this. We don't have to talk about properties in order for that to be true. And so we're committed to individual dogs, but not to abstract entities like the property of whiteness, on Quine's view. And
sorry, just to explain that just a bit, why is that the case? Doesn't it seem sort of implicit if we say that dogs are white, that we've by saying that they are white, we've talked about this, we mentioned the word white. So in what sense does that not require something like whiteness? Yeah, well, I think it does, right? And I think you're on to an important idea there. The reason Quine thinks it doesn't is simply because he takes the sort of first order quantifier, what we have to say there is, what are the sort of noun terms, in a sense, in our original sentence, as the mark of ontological commitment. So the way he's thinking of it, we have to say there are dogs, and we have to say things about them. We have to predicate things of them, like white, that they are white, right? But we don't have to say this would be the Quinean way of putting it, there's this additional thing, whiteness. Right. But I think that the point you raise was raised very shortly after Quine's article by both Alston and Searle, who say roughly, but look, from some dogs are white, you can just make this kind of trivial inference that says, look, if some dogs are white, then there's a property of whiteness that some dogs have. I mean, in normal English, that just sounds like a redundant and pretentious way of saying the same thing, right? And if that's the case, then you are sort of implicitly committed to whiteness all along when you say some dogs are white.
And that's the view that I take up too. And that's one aspect of easy ontology and how it gives you a different result in the Quinean criterion. So I think all you do is, if you want to make the Quinean move, is resist taking on the concept or noun term of whiteness. But it's not that you're not really committed to whiteness, because that follows from what you accept, that there are some white dogs, and the kind of trivial inferences you can make from there's some white dogs to some dogs have the property of whiteness.
Right. So it sounds like Quine is saying, excuse the siren if you can hear it. I live in New York City. So it sounds like what Quine is saying is, we don't have we have to quantify over the thing we're talking about, but anything we say of it, we don't have to quantify. So we don't have to grant it existence. We can say that the dog can be white without having to be this whiteness. Mm-hmm. But then it does follow then that if we want to be able to say of the kind of properties that we apply to things, if we want to be able to talk about them as nouns, then we're going to eventually have to be committed to them as well if we want to be able to make that step. And it sounds like that's what you're saying. Your view is we do want to be able to make an inference from applying a property to there being that property. And so we're going to have to be committed to it as well. Is that about?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a further question of whether we should admit property terms as nouns into our language, right? And one impetus of a kind of Quinean view might be to say, again, on this sort of analogy with science, what we want is a parsimonious view. If we don't need these terms, don't admit them. Quine famously thought we do have to admit noun terms for numbers, right, and sets and so on. So I think we can get into that question of whether, and if so, why we'd want noun terms for properties. But for me, that's a practical question. Mm-hmm. Right? But if you ask, are there properties? Is there whiteness? You're using the term and using that term with its rules of use in place, rules that entitle you to go from the dog's white to the dog has the property of whiteness. I think there's only one answer. Yes, there's whiteness.
Right. Okay, so at this point, we're getting pretty close to what your view is. But before getting into it, I want to take another historical step back and talk about Carnap, because I know that Carnap's view is really important to you, as kind of something like a starting point for where you go into your view. So can you talk a bit about Carnap's contribution to all this?
Sure. So Carnap, of course, was a teacher of Quine's. He held this view that there are roughly two ways of understanding existence questions. You can understand them as what he called internal questions or as external questions. As internal questions, he thought they typically, at least, include things like, did King Arthur really exist? Is there a piece of paper on my desk? Is there a prime number between 10 and 20? Right, whatever. And these internal questions, he thought, are straightforwardly resolvable by what he called either logical or empirical means. So if you want to find out if there's a piece of paper on your desk, you go look. If you want to find out if King Arthur really existed, you do your historical work. If you want to find out if there's a prime number between 10 and 20, you do your calculations. That would be your logical means. Then he thought there's also an external sense to these questions, which is, again, typically phrased in this sort of general form, saying things like, are there really people? Not that King Arthur really exists. Are there really numbers? Right, rather than is there a prime between 10 and 20? Are there really material objects? Rather than is there a piece of paper on my desk? And Carnap said that there's two ways of understanding these external questions. That taken literally, they're meaningless, they're pseudo-questions. But that we can also but that can't be what's getting the metaphysicians arguing. We can also understand them, reinterpret them as implicitly practical questions about whether or not we should adopt a language of noun terms for numbers, for example, the number framework, as Carnap would have put it, or whether we should adopt a material object framework in our ways of talking, or just speak in a sort of phenomenal term in terms of what appears to us, and so on.
Why did he think that, taken literally, they must be pseudo-questions?
Okay, so that's a good question. one reason Carnap was often rejected is because people thought that was based on verificationism. That is the view, it takes various forms, but in this case, all it would take is the view that a statement that can't be verified is meaningless.
Okay.
And verificationism was thought to be a super problematic philosophical position for reasons we can get into if you're interested. So people thought, oh, no, that's not. We don't have to accept that. And a lot of metaphysicians would say, oh, Carnap thought these external questions taken in a non-practical way were pseudo questions, but that's just verificationism. We all know that's dead and gone. Let's get back to metaphysics, is what a lot of my contemporary metaphysical interlocutors would have said. I read it in a different way. So here's how, and I sort of follow Hugh Price in this. Here's how I read Carnap on this, on the internal-external distinction. I read Carnap's internal questions as questions that are asked simply using a piece of language with its extant rules of use intact. So our number terms, our person terms, our material object terms, whatever. And then the reason that external questions taken literally are meaningless on my view, on my interpretation of Carnap, is because that would have to involve severing these terms from their rules of use. And without rules of use, existence questions are just meaningless. Just like if you ask, are there huasadus? And I just made up that word, I haven't made up any rules of use for it, that question can't be answered yes or no unless you know what the term huasadu means. Right? You can ask the question, should we take up this term? And if so, what rules should we attach it to? Right? That would be the pragmatic interpretation of the external question.
Okay. So you're saying it's not really a matter of there being verification or not. It's really that these kind of big terms. Exactly. Yeah, I want to go into this a little bit more. Is it that there's no clear rules of use for these huge general terms, or is it that? Yeah, would you say that that's it? Is that like we don't have clear use of rules of use for these big terms like number and everyday objects? Would you say that is that sort of what you're saying?
No, I do think we have rules for them, and because of that, I think these questions can be answered easily. So, I mean, obviously, at some points, these rules will turn out to be indeterminate or vague, but we can talk about that separately. So, take the question, are there numbers? Right. The question, is there a prime number between 10 and 20, can be answered easily, and the answer is yes. Right? If there's a prime number between 10 and 20, then we're entitled by the rules of use of our number term to say there is a number. Right? So I think we can easily answer these kinds of questions, these kinds of general existence questions. But now most metaphysicians would say, you can't answer it that easily. It's not that simple, right? There's more to be done here. But I think what we need to do is to reconceive of what they can still be asking. When you say, well, look, there's a number between 10 and 20 that's prime, so of course there's numbers, right? Reconceive of what they're asking as asking whether we should adopt the number language at all, noun terms for numbers, that is. And if so, how this should work, what rules of use we should have. Should we only have, should we only accept the existence of mathematical entities for which there's a constructive proof, or should we accept all sorts of others, and so on. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm trying to understand Carnap's position on external questions being meaningless, and I think I'm starting to understand it. It seems like there's it seems to be related to the use mention distinction. Yes. And I remember you talked about that a bit in your book. Would you say that that's about right? Yeah. Okay, could you sort of explain that a little bit? How Carnap's take on why external questions are kind of pseudo questions that have taken literally kind of maps onto that use mention distinction.
Yeah. So let me take an easier question than numbers. Let's take properties, which we talked about before. Okay, so suppose that I use a normal property term like whiteness, yeah, and I say these three dogs have the property of whiteness. Now, given the way that property language is introduced, you're entitled, and this is pretty, I'm just putting it sort of informally, what Carnap does much more technically, and his interest is mostly with technical languages, and part of what I do is try to generalize that. But given the way property terms work, as we discussed before, they follow certain rules. So as a kid, you might learn that if you can say, those dogs are white, but you can also say, those dogs have something in common. Namely, they all share the property of whiteness. And if the first is true, the second's guaranteed to be true. So internal questions, the way I read them in Carnap, are questions that are asked simply using a term like whiteness with its standard rules intact. So if you say, is there such a property as whiteness? You can say, yeah, those dogs have it. And you're just applying the term in accord with its standard rules that let you move from there are white dogs to the dogs have the property of whiteness. Now that's all well and good, right? But that can't be, Carnap thought, and I think this is right, what the metaphysicians are arguing about. Because that would answer the question so quickly and easily that it wouldn't explain why there have been all these debates about whether there are properties. So what else are they doing when they say, yeah, I know those dogs are white, and so you can say they have the property of whiteness, but the question is, are there really properties? Do properties really exist? Right? What are they doing there? Right? Well, the thought is that if they're still using the term property or whiteness with the usual rules, they're just going to get the easy answer. Well, yes, there are. We just did that, right? So what else can they be doing? And this is where the use-mention distinction comes in. So in answering the internal question, you're using the term with its rules intact. In shifting to the external question, one way to understand what can still be going on there that's in some sense meaningful and legitimate, it would be meaningless if you just detached it from all its rules and didn't give it any others. But what you can be doing is mentioning the term and say, take terms like whiteness or redness or roundness or whatever, right? Should we accept these terms into our vocabulary in the best language or in our scientific language or whatever? And if so, what rules should they follow? So here's a question that's probably left indeterminate by our property talk. Are there properties that aren't instantiated? That is there such a thing as a property of being a unicorn? You can't point to something and say, that's a unicorn, so there's a property of being a unicorn. What should we do? So those would all be sort of among the external questions reformulated as questions that can be meaningfully expressed, mentioning the term and asking whether we should take it into our vocabulary, what rules it should follow, if we do, and so on. So that's the way in which I try to map the use-mention distinction onto the internal-external distinction of Carnap.
That makes sense. So it's kind of, rather than actually using the rules and applying them, you're kind of asking whether should we even have this term with these rules? Should the rules be sort of different? But at that point, you're kind of asking about the term and the linguistic framework, and not about this substantial thing with some language we've already agreed on that we can use. Exactly.
And so that can still be a sensible question, very much worth engaging in, for reasons we can talk about more later. But it's really a practical question, what Carnap would have called a pragmatic question about what framework we should adopt, or you can call it a practical question about what language or conceptual system we should use.
Okay, so now that we've kind of seen the, Carnap's view and Quine's view, maybe now let's get back to the contemporary arena. And before going straight into your view, I want to ask you one more thing about the contemporary arena, and that is, we've talked about the kind of neo-Quinean approach of theory selection and that whole thing. Now, what that has led to is contemporary metaphysics, what you're in your book sometimes called hard metaphysics. And that sometimes has people looking for kind of substantive criteria of existence. Like, in order to determine what exists, we need to find out, well, do these things have, causal power or, So I guess you already did mention causal power. What are some of these other kind of popular criteria of existence that are at the heart of the contemporary ontological project?
Yeah, the two you see most often raised in arguments usually against some kind of entity are causal powers, the so-called Eleatic criterion, that is, to be real is to have causal powers, or sometimes it's put as to be real is to have distinctive causal powers that nothing else has, and mind independence. So a lot of other arguments are based on the idea that for something to really exist, is for it to be mind independent. And then this is often used in arguments against the existence of things like social objects, social kinds, fictional characters, things like that. It makes some sense to the extent that if you found you'd really just imagined a unicorn in your bedroom last night as opposed to seeing one, we'd want to say, oh, that was just mind dependent, that didn't really exist, right? So it gets its sort of motivation from that kind of use. So those are the two most common. Sometimes you see other criteria appealed to, like observability. People think only observables exist, or trackability. But it's, I think, mind independence and causal powers or causal non-redundancy are the most standard. Some also, of course, think that to be real, you have to be posited by one of the natural sciences. Right, and that's one way of applying a kind of Quinean criterion.
Okay, so now that I think we have a pretty good picture both of like the history and the current arena. So now give me like the spark notes of easy ontology.
Okay, so the basic view of easy ontology is that questions about what exists aren't sort of deep theoretical questions to be where we can discover the answers through serious ontological debates of the traditional kind we've been talking about. Instead, that all of those questions that are well-formed and meaningful are answerable by empirical and or conceptual means, and often by trivial inferences from a starting place that nobody disagrees about. So let me take you through some examples of all of those. Mm-hmm. Existence questions that can be answered empirically. Things like, are there still red-bellied woodpeckers in the woods of Arkansas? Well, you send your ornithologists out with their cameras and their trackers and so on and figure it out empirically. Conceptual questions can be answered conceptually will include some of the mathematical questions that we talked about before. But here's a place where you can really see the easy ontology, is that quite a lot of existence questions you can get answers to by trivial inferences from a starting place that everybody accepts. So we've talked about properties, right? Philosophers have disagreed about whether properties exist. Nobody disagrees that this paper is white, right? But if this paper is white, then you can go by a trivial inference to the paper has the property of whiteness, to there's a property. There's been lots of disagreements about numbers. Nobody disagrees, say, that there are 2 pens on my desk. I assume there are. If there are 2 pens on my desk, then you can make a trivial inference to the number of pens on my desk is 2. If there's a number of pens on my desk, namely 2, then there's a number, namely 2. Right? Settle that question. Take debates about ordinary objects, right? So those who think there aren't ordinary objects will often say things like, there's no desk there, there's just particles arranged desk-wise in the right size and shape and put that way in the right historical context by artisans or whatever you think it takes. Nobody disagrees that there are particles arranged desk-wise in this room, but if there are particles arranged desk-wise, that's all you need to know if you're a competent speaker of English to be able to infer there's a desk. And so there are desks. And we're done. So that's the easy ontology. And one of the important things that distinguishes it from the sort of neo-Quinean approach is that it avoids the kind of epistemological mysteries that come from thinking of ontology as engaged in this sort of super deep work of trying to discover what really exists in ways that might overturn common sense and also overturn science, right? I mean, there are those who deny that organisms and mountains exist, but obviously biologists and geologists speak of organisms and mountains and think there are such things and there's stuff to explain about them. So it avoids those kinds of epistemological mysteries. It settles a lot of these questions where otherwise we seem to have sort of an endless, unresolvable debate and a proliferation of positions that might lead to skepticism about whether we could ever know it, and so on. There's another side of this that I hope we'll come to later, which is I do think that there's still something like external questions that remains, and that's where the action is. external questions of figuring out what language and conceptual scheme we should use and how we should use it, engaging in these kinds of practical questions. And that's ultimately where I will relocate the work of metaphysics. Then we should think of metaphysics as engaged or as an enterprise that should be engaged in that kind of conceptual work, not as like a pseudoscience that's trying to discover what really exists in ways that might overturn the views of ordinary people and scientists.
But in a way more as engaged in what might be the best way to describe things?
Yes.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, Professor Thomasson discusses common objections to her approach to ontology. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.